There's been a lot of interest around workflows with Reltio Integration Hub, and in some of the surveys and some of the questions on the community. This is again a hot topic. We do, and I'll put this in the notes or in the comments in a minute. We do have a show that we've done on workflows with Reltio Integration Hub that Dan went pretty deep in, but we continue to see more questions, which is good. And so Dan reached out to me on Friday and said, "Hey, let's do something on Monday." I was like, "Okay." And really, this is not a presentation today. This is an Ask Me Anything. We do have one or two questions that we'll start this show with, but the show will be more aligned to what you, as the audience, want to ask Dan. So this could be really short, or it could go all the way to an hour. So it's just going to really be up to you guys. But just before we get started, though, Dan, keep yourself on mute. Questions should be asked in the chat, and we will take yes and no. I mean, you can ask them in the chat. We'll make sure to get to them. You can take yourself off of mute and ask as well. This call is going to be recorded and posted as usual. Fortunately, I couldn't figure out the survey this morning, so there's no survey pop up at the end. I tried. We do have a lot of shows coming up, and more specifically this week, that we are excited about, and we continue to add. So today's kind of pop up on Ask Me Anything with workflows with Reltio Integration Hub. We do have a show on BYOK, Bring Your Own Key, Taking Control of Your Data with Reltio Shield. We've never done that before, but Reltio Shield has been around a while, so I wanted to make sure we get that in the books. And then we have, I'm not going to go into all of these, but we have a lot of shows coming up. I'll push this into the chat as well. So we're really excited about those. And then lastly, just want to give a quick plug. We are going to have what we call an industry event called Data Driven 23. It will be from October 3rd through 5th, 2023 here in Dallas, Texas. I live in Dallas, so it's perfect for me. I'll push that into the link or into the comments as well. So I'm not gonna stop sharing, but what I will do is go into the first question, Dan, and then after the first question, I will stop sharing. And then I think that's kind of how we wanted to start this, right, Dan? Is start with this question, or okay. The first question, I'm just going to read them, and then I'll do the same in the comments or in the chat if you bring one up. So the first question was, I'm trying to create a custom workflow with 3 steps that should be triggered whenever a new profile is created for an entity in Reltio Integration Hub. Could you help with your inputs in achieving this? He attached his workflow. The image is in a specific file. He said, I didn't create any new listener classes for this workflow. So this is kind of what his workflow looks like. Just get people to kind of look at it real quick. I'm going to stop sharing, Dan.
Okay.
And let you kind of answer that question.
So yeah, a couple things that I'll point out is when he makes reference to the listener classes, when you go into the Reltio workflow, and I'm going to go ahead and pull it up. I just need to clear a few things that I was preparing on my desktop here away. Like my daughter likes to say, clean up, clean up.
And by the way, looks like so far about almost 40 people on at such last minute. So there's some interest in asking questions around Reltio Integration Hub workflow.
No, that's great. That is really great. So for the rest of the audience here, when he mentions the listener classes, when you build a workflow, and obviously I have the most simple workflow possible, it just, whenever you go into the Reltio workflow modeler, which is available inside the Reltio console, you have a start point and an end point. In between that start point and end point, you can have multiple steps, which are just obviously these step boxes that you would drag in. And you can connect those steps in any order that you like. So in that case, I have just added another step. Now, what this step does is completely at the discretion of the workflow builder. And that, of course, is going to be driven by the requirements of your business. So if you want that task to go to a user and have some user perform an action, you would make it a user task, and then it would notify them through their Reltio inbox. It would send them an email notification. It would appear on their Reltio dashboard. And of course, they could do a search for it and find tasks that were assigned to them. What he's also mentioned is the idea of what's called a service task. And by choosing a service task, it allows you to go out and write Java code. So Reltio provides some base classes. And for those of you that are Java savvy, you can inherit from the Reltio Java class, and it will create all of the base methods and objects that you need. And you simply go into the designated methods and you just override the methods that Reltio is going to invoke at the appropriate time. And you add your logic into those positions where the action is going to take. So when this workflow step gets invoked, it's going to have just an execute phase, and you would simply put your code into the execute phase. So you don't really have to understand all of the Reltio object functions. You simply just need to inherit, go into the execute phase, add your code. There is definitely a deployment process. There's a way that you can test it on your local machine, and it is documented on the Reltio documentation portal. You would have to test it locally. Because you are deploying to a SaaS environment, there is a process where you have to take that jar file and you have to submit it through a Jira ticket into the Reltio DevOps team, and they will deploy that jar file into a location, and they will give you back a path that you can reference so that when you're building out that process in your listener, you would come in here, and where it says Java class here, you would put in the path that they give you to invoke that. So from that perspective, the significance of those service tasks is directly within the workflow itself. And my interpretation of the question, it was more around the idea of how do we trigger the workflow itself. Creating a custom workflow with 3 steps that should be triggered when a new profile is created, and he wants to attach his workflow image, and he's seeing listener classes. So Dan,
so I was the one that posted the question.
Yes, Manoj, please.
Yeah, my question was, let's say if I'm creating a profile from the hub, and if I want to trigger that, whenever the user is creating a profile, it should automatically go to the particular workflow. So, and along with multiple steps of approval, and assign it back to the user if at all there are issues with the comment.
Okay, so you want to automate the invocation of the workflow when they create the object. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's what I interpret.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. That's perfect, because that's what I'm prepared to show in more detail. And then, of course, this is an Ask Me Anything. So we're the whole purpose of this is to be able to go off script. So let's go back and we'll work from that premise. So what I have is a tenant here, and I'm going to work with the material object, but what I'm going to show you is going to work for absolutely any entity type. But I'm going to work with material just because I only have 2 objects that are currently in there. And typically what I would recommend, there's 2 approaches that you can take to being able to trigger the workflow. And the question becomes, how does Reltio know that a new object or a new profile has been created? So there's 2 methods there. The first method would be the event queue. So for those of you that are not familiar with the event queue, everything within Reltio is going to generate business events. And those business events, if you look in your tenant management section, you have internal queues, which are going to monitor things like matching and merging and re-indexing and things like that. But you also have these external queues. And on this tenant, and time permitting, I'll go in and I'll actually show you an example on this external queue. But I have actually activated an external queue And even though the tenant that I'm deployed on is running inside of GCP, it's deployed on the Google platform. I personally am more comfortable working with the Amazon queues. I have more familiarity there. So I have deployed an Amazon queue. When you bring it in, you would just bring in, I think when I deployed this one, I deployed it with the key and secret key. It is typically Reltio's best practices now to use the ARN. But once the queue is deployed, it simply comes down to saying which events do I want to have published to that queue, and the entity create, the entity changed, entity split, which is an unmerge, and then entity merge is definitely self-explanatory there. So the idea there is, do you want to send a snapshot, which is the whole object, a snapshot of just selected fields in which it'll give you a pop-up and let you choose which fields, or the deltas, which is going to give you the before and after of which fields have changed. So this is one method of knowing when a profile has been created, is if you use that change event, and then inside of Reltio Integration Hub, which is, for those of you that may not be familiar with that, it's a module. It is included with your Reltio license, and you can access the Reltio Integration Hub. And it provides to you a mechanism where you can come in and create a recipe, and you can listen to that queue, and you can actually do it as a triggered event. And the triggered event, and this is similar to what we call change data capture. So the triggered event, and I have SQS here, is one that I've frequently used. But if you look down here, you can actually listen for change events in a wide variety of applications. And the process effectively works the same. There is a native Amazon SQS. We definitely recommend using the one that has been optimized for Reltio. But in that case, when a new message or a new bundle of messages arrive, and then you'll need the credentials for that Reltio tenant. I've already entered those there with that ARN. But what you'll see is I can now go in and I can create a loop, and the input list is going to be all the messages that came out of that queue. So in this case, if you are listening to the queue, you can now have the ability to loop through and take some action for each event that got created. And in this case, I would want to put in an if condition, and I would want to say if the event type, and I may need to do a little bit of parsing in here because the event type is actually inside the body of the message. And again, we can come back and touch on this because there's another method that I think is going to be a little bit simpler that we're going to touch on. So the takeaway is that you do have this option. The option of using the event queue is that it is effectively going to be a much more near real-time method of listening to those change events. So I'm just going to back out of this. The second method is to have basically an attribute on the object. Either you can have an attribute that says, I am ready for approval process, or if anytime you create the record, you automatically want it to go into approval. And this comes down to your business process. So what I'm going to demonstrate there is I'm going to go back into my Reltio data modeler. And again, I mentioned I'm going to work with the material object. So I have all the default data objects here, and I'm going to add a new item. Request review, and I'm simply going to make it a Boolean object and save that. Oh, and it actually already exists. Apparently I've done this before. And here you can see that it's actually already there. So we will just for the purposes of this, we will do so we can walk through the process and make sure that we are doing it in a full cycle since we are recording this session. So we're going to have an attribute that indicates that we want to start the process. And then what I also recommend is having an attribute that tracks the process ID. And this attribute could be hidden if you choose. So you can actually make this attribute hidden so that it's not displayed on the screen. What I typically would recommend is starting it off not hidden so that for debug purposes, you can actually see it on the screen. And then when you go to production, you may say, I'm going to make it hidden because I want to keep track. And the process ID here is going to be the workflow that gets triggered with this workflow. And the significance of that is being able to know whether or not that workflow has been completed. So the significance here is I've created the community review attribute, and that's got placed up here, and then the process ID. So when I go back into a material and just indicate that I want to create a new material, and I'm going to need to refresh my browser because I've made a change to my data model. So the Reltio data model is cached in the browser because I made that change in a different browser window. I simply need to refresh this window so that it will take the browser, the data model changes that were made in a different browser session and bring them over to this browser session. And of course, you also have the option to go into the Reltio UI modeler and to move those fields into an appropriate space. I'm not going to worry about that for our purposes. And this is just going to be, I like to use the dates. So it's VOR 24 and it's currently 018 on this, and it's going to be test 018. And I'm going to request community review, and the process ID, again, I'm going to leave blank for now. And the benefit of having this community review is if I'm working on this product and I'm a business user, if maybe I start editing some of this data and I'm going to come back and maybe there's some research that I need to go and do before I decide what the G10 is, maybe I need to go someplace or what country it's going to be manufactured in. I need to go and contact somebody from manufacturing. If I decide what service tier or what life cycle phase or what roles are going to be able to have access to this, any other information that needs to be gathered before starting the workflow, I may choose to say, no, it's not ready for community review yet. And I can still be working on this item before that workflow gets started. So the benefit of having that flag in there gives the business user who's onboarding this record, it gives them the ability to manually decide when they want to push that record into review. And you can also have a saved search here, I'm going to save that record. That each user could come in and they could say, I want to look for materials that were created by myself, where the community review is no. And of course, there's none right now, but if they save that search, it gives them the ability to have a saved search that they can come back to, and they can keep track of records that they need to work on. And then records that are pending review, they can come in here and they can see those. So now we've adjusted the data model. We've prepared the record to indicate that, yes, it's going to be ready for review. Now we want to actually trigger a workflow to start the review to invite people outside of the original author to participate in this review process. And that's where we recommend the Reltio Integration Hub. So we're going to go back. And again, I'm just going to start with a new recipe. And in this case, I'm going to run it on a scheduled basis. And the smallest scheduling interval is every 5 minutes. You can actually extend this out and run once an hour, once a day. The resource pool is relatively small. You'll see the way that I'm going to run it. If the first step that we're going to do is actually going to be use the Reltio component, and we're going to perform a search, and we're going to look for those records that are materials where equals So you can see by using the Reltio search, it's only going to find records where the community review is true. And then because I put that second attribute in there, the process ID, so once we are able, then I think I spelled that incorrectly, Pierre. So once we assign a workflow, we're going to take the workflow identifier and put it into that process ID. And that's going to allow us so that next time we come through, the record is still going to be checked for community review. But because we have assigned a workflow, it will prevent us from assigning another workflow, and it would no longer meet our search criteria because that process ID will have been completed. And then really all we need to get is the URI, because and this is an important factor here, because if you decide that the workflow that you're going to trigger is going to vary. So in some cases inside of the workflow, you may choose to do conditional logic and say, if it's product class A, then I'm going to send it to one reviewer. If it's product class B, I'm going to send it to a different reviewer. Well, you could actually do that inside the Reltio Integration Hub. You could just have reviewer group A as one workflow and reviewer group B as a different workflow. And inside of your Reltio Integration Hub, the code that we're about to see here, where I'm going to launch that workflow, you could do that validation check or that rule for which workflow to invoke inside of Reltio Integration Hub. And it would be a little bit simpler because inside of Reltio Integration Hub, you're in this low code, no code environment. Whereas if you're trying to do those conditional checks inside of the workflow itself, you're more than likely going to have to resort to Java. And it's a little bit more complicated process to create that logic and deploy it. So let me start and just see if there are any questions at this point, and if everybody is following the process that we have.
There are questions, but I'm not sure that they're specifically about this. So,
all right. Well, what are your thoughts, Chris? Do we want to take them, or are they going to sidetrack us?
Yeah, let me just ask them, and let's see if you can kind of answer them as we go. Hopefully that was very detailed, Dan, on the first question. So thank you. Can we assign DCR and potential requests to a particular group based on source? So suppose if a profile is having source A, when a DCR or potential match request is raised, do we have an option to assign only to group A with out-of-the-box features? And can we automate above tasks for potential match requests?
All right, so the data change request, if you're initiating the data change request through the Reltio UI, there is only one data request workflow that the Reltio UI recognizes. So if you're using the Reltio UI to go into suggesting mode to make a change, then having the workflow route differently based upon the source or any other criteria, it is possible, but you would have to use one of those service tasks. So if we still have it open, yeah. So in this case, this service task would effectively, you would bring in a conditional or. See. And so what you can see here is in the service task itself, you could perform some logic, and based upon that logic, you could output the logic. And then in these conditions here, you can put, if return equals path 1, and then here it would be if return equals path 2. Well, this one should have been path 1. So in this case, inside of this service task, you would need to have a return variable, and that return variable would return path 1 or path 2. So what you would do is you would effectively need to edit the default data change request. So if you were making the suggesting change through the Reltio UI, now conversely, if you were making the data change request through code, yeah, when you do an update, there's a parameter that says always create DCR is true. And when you set that parameter to true, what you're actually going to get returned is a change request object. And then you make a second API call and you pass that change request object for your entity, and you give it the name of the workflow task that you want to use to review that. So by using the default data change request review process, it would follow that one process. But by having multiple data change request review processes, if you were initiating that change outside of Reltio, you could choose to invoke data change request review path 1, data change request review path 2. So if you're doing it through the UI, you would need to create a service task to create the branch in the default data change request. If you're doing it outside of Reltio, you could just create straightforward workflows and invoke them based upon your logic. All right, Chris.
All right, next question. Can we throw custom message error warnings based on the workflow logic? And will the workflow logic or deployment be the same for RDM as well?
Workflow and RDM is definitely a little bit of a different animal. So I'm going to definitely defer that, because what's being used in RDM today is likely going to change over the next 12 months. Today, workflow in RDM is just a single step workflow, and it is not customizable. So it is definitely on our roadmap to use the standard workflow engine, which would follow the path of the rest of the workflow process. So with that in mind, if a workflow is being processed and if a workflow is invoked and this service task returns an error, then the person who sees the error is going to be, it's definitely going to be logged into the system. And I would definitely recommend that proper software development lifecycle would encourage you to use try accept blocks in your Java code. And in your accept block, if an error is thrown, that you log it to your appropriate console into some area that's going to be reportable and accessible. But the message itself should go to the screen of the user who performed the last action. So in this case, if it happened here, the user who started the workflow would get the message. In the case where we're about to trigger a workflow from Reltio Integration Hub, Reltio Integration Hub would likely get the message, the error message. If I am inside a Reltio profile and I choose to launch a workflow and that launch workflow triggers a message, I would get a pop-up message and I should see that error. But there's definitely some, for lack of a better word, best practices, I guess, in making sure that the error is being reported in a way that is going to be passed back to the user. But it's definitely something I think we would need to take to support to make sure that you're following a method that is going to, so
Yeah.
short answer is I don't have a definitive answer on that. I think
That's a good answer. I mean, it's not 100%, but I'm not 100% following this question, but I'm going to try, and Jolly. But if you want to speak up, that'd be great. Who creates this ARN and Q key and Securist? I'm not really following that.
no, I definitely follow there.
Okay, good.
So the idea there is when you're creating a new queue, inside of Reltio, if as part of your standard Reltio license agreement, I'm going to not save that. As part of your standard Reltio license agreement, you get 3 queues. So you get a dev tenant, a test tenant, and a production tenant. Each of those tenants should come with a queue. If you go into your external queue section and you do not have a queue available, you can definitely submit a support ticket and Reltio will issue the queue for your environment. Now, if you've got budget, if you say, hey, I want Reltio to create 6 queues for my tenant, there would be a very, very small fee. Reltio effectively just takes whatever Amazon would charge us for the queue. And I think there's a 5% markup or whatever it is, administrative overhead. And we would present that back to your company. But if you can go to your system administrators, whoever owns your Amazon account or your Google account, and they can initiate the creation of the queue and they generate that ARN, then you could simply go in here and just say add configuration and you can put that ARN in directly here. So it can go either direction. Reltio can generate it or you can generate it. It does require somebody with Reltio tenant administrative privileges to associate that queue with your tenant. But that should answer.
Great. Is it recommended to call the workflow for bulk request? If yes, what is the maximum number of requests for the same?
Are they asking if you can bulk launch multiple workflows?
Utsa, what was your question? Take yourself off mute. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, Dan. I'm asking for multiple requests at the same time.
Yeah, so the short answer is I don't think so, because looking at the API itself, it's only taking a single object, which means that I don't think that it would, well, I take that back. It is taking an array. So if you wanted to start this workflow for 3 entities, because it's an array, you definitely, as long as you're starting the same type of workflow, I would think you could pass, 1,000 or more objects. I don't think there's necessarily a limit. The biggest concern you would have is around timeouts. That if you invoke this API and if it takes 5 minutes to run, you would need to make sure that your invoking process is willing to wait 5 minutes and not time out. And then you would want to make sure that the endpoint is going to continue to process and not abandon if it's taking 5 minutes to if you passed in 8,000 records.
So Dan, so one thing is, let's say if we take about the scenario of potential match review, not this review. So if we automate that, so let's say we just filter some bulk entities and put them into the request of the potential match review. So that can also generate multiple bulk requests at the same time, right?
Yes.
Because there can be multiple potential matches at the same time. So just thinking that can be an overhead if the number of potential matches are too high, right?
Unfortunately, I don't have a specific threshold. I think that's something that we can either, if you want to post a message on the community, we can loop in our product management team to try and respond to that. Or if we submit a support ticket, that would get the same thing. But going through the community is probably a better approach because we're going to get the same answer in either route. But putting it through the community makes it available to other users who might have interest in that same question.
And I can push the PM to answer, and it'd be a little bit easier, but the PM will answer most likely on that. So, or somebody that knows.
Yeah. So in the short answer is going to be it's ultimately going to revolve around the timeout, because inside of Reltio, just in this simple case here, now obviously I'm passing the same ID, but let's, if we assume that these were different, if these were 3 different records that we were creating this on, inside of Reltio, these may not get sent to 3 different node clusters. They may all come to the same node cluster, but at the very least, they're going to be 3 different threads. So the work is definitely going to be segmented. And then if you were to make these calls, and if you were to, let's say, if you wanted to make 10,000 of these calls, and you were to bundle them up into 100 or let's just say for easy numbers, you wanted to make 10,000 and you put 1,000 entities in each call and you made 10 calls, each of those calls would definitely go to a different node in the cluster, just because it's going to use a round robin in the cluster assignment, the load balancer. And technically the load balancer, it'll default to round robin unless one of the nodes is significantly busier than another. Then it will avoid the busiest node in a round robin on the less busy nodes. But the point being is that if there's, let's say, 6 nodes in the cluster and you make 10 calls, the first 6 are each going to be on 6 different node clusters, and each within those node clusters, they're going to be processing on multiple threads. So the processing is still going to be reasonably fast, but then it's still got to go back to the workflow server. And, inside the workflow server, it's got to launch and log everything that's getting done here. So there is the potential of timeouts or anything like that. So you would just want to make sure that you're optimizing or minimizing the potential for timeouts.
Great.
Chris?
Next, does somebody have all right, next question. Is it possible to, will it be possible to attachment in the DCRC process to Reltio?
Yeah, the short answer there is no. There is a comment field, and in the comment, you could put a URL to a document. That document could be in a SharePoint file, a Google Doc, a Microsoft Office link or whatever. But the comment is going to be your only real approach to doing that. So let's actually get back and let's finish up this workflow scenario that we started, and it'll show an example of that
Okay.
that we potentially use. So back to where we started off, we created the data structure that said, I want to be able to request community review, and the process ID is currently missing. So inside of our console, we have a process that's going to run on a scheduled basis, in this case, every 5 minutes. It's going to search for records where the community review is true and the process ID is not yet assigned. It's going to get the URI for those records. It's going to loop through those records. And again, for anybody not familiar with Reltio Integration Hub, it is important for that loop that you associate that loop with the output of that record. It's called a data pill. So data pill is basically the information that you're going to iterate through. So if you think about a for each, which is clearly what it's called here, it's for each of what? And it's going to be the results from the search. So in this case, whether it finds one record or whether it finds 100 records, it's going to go through each of them. And in our case, we're going to process them just one at a time. There are ways you can optimize this and process them in batch, and that will minimize your task utilization. But for demonstration and testing, processing them one at a time tends to be easier. And effectively, what we're going to want to do is just start the workflow. But what I like to do, just for demonstration purposes, just to make sure that I am getting what I expect, I like to just create a variable, call it URI, and I'm going to get the URI from step 3. Now, there's the step 2, but I want to get it from inside the loop, because as the loop iterates through, and I can save, and I can actually run this in test mode. It's going to run that query, and actually this is good, because what we're seeing is that nothing was found, which means that this search result did not produce any outputs, which tells me that my community review is true, did not produce the expected results. Yep.
The beauty of demos.
Yeah. Is yes, maybe. Okay, so one thing that I've learned to do in Reltio, when you have an API that's not giving you what you want, because everything in the Reltio search is really just an API, by opening up the developer console here, I can actually see what's coming in. Community review is looking for the value true. So I don't know if you can see how I found that. I just turned on the developer true and just toggled the search. And here you can see the entities search that's over there. And I can see community review. It's looking for the word true. So I can now take that into my filter. That's it. Ending in 5WP. That's the record we want. 5WP. So curious what is different.
Then most probably attributes A was in capital letter. That's why.
Yep, you're most likely correct. So yep.
See, it's great.
And I definitely can keep it as material. And hence the desire to do a little debugging. So now that I've got that working, I can come in here. I can actually just ignore this. It really doesn't hurt anything. I'm going to want to invoke the Reltio workflow. So there is currently not a action in the Reltio step here for workflow. So I'm going to choose a custom action. And I'm going to call it start workflow. And I've got a separate document over here where I'm going to bring in all of the details, but I will provide those to Chris to put in. So it is going to be a post. The path is, most importantly, this needs to be your tenant ID, and this needs to be your workflow server, which for the majority of our customers, the workflow server is going to be prod, P-R-O-D -workflow.reltio. And because I'm part of our sales organization, we have our own dedicated workflow server that doesn't interfere with our customers' live production. And inside of that, there needs to be a header parameter. So you'll notice that by default, the header parameters are not displayed. So down here at the option where it says 2 optional fields, you need to click on this link and say that I need to be able to change a header parameter and then hit apply. And now that the header parameters, where are they? Request headers. Add a header, and the header is going to be environment URL, and my environment is http://gussales.reltio.com. So this is one of the areas where when you're building out your process, you'll start in dev.reltio.com, and then you may migrate it to test.reltio.com, and then eventually to 360 or wherever your production Reltio environment is. So this is definitely something you'll want to have as part of your promotion process, is to make sure that this becomes a variable that you migrate as part of your promotion. So now that we have those parameters, there is a request process of what I am going to pass in, and that's going to be part of my input. And you'll see that again, the input, you can add them manually or use a sample JSON, and I like to use the sample JSON. And what you can also have is a comment, and this will give you that ability to show the file that you mentioned earlier. So just by putting in the sample of what the payload would look like coming in, and I think I actually got that backwards. I think that's, yeah, that was the response payload. My Zoom meeting was covering up my request payload. So I need to redo that. So I am going to clear that. And there's my comment, was already in there. The significance is the entity is in an array. That's what immediately tipped me off that was incorrect. So the input is a request, and then it's the response that's just going to give that process ID. All right, so just to summarize here, we've used the Reltio component with a custom action. We called the custom action start workflow. It's a post method. We put in the path for the API to start a workflow process instance. I have hard-coded my Reltio tenant instance. Notice that when we chose the Reltio tenant, it automatically chose the connection that we used from step 2. So all that's good. For the input, we ingested the default schema. We had to enable the header so that we could put the environment parameter and tell the workflow server which environment the workflow should be on. And then we defined the response body. So all that's good. So now we can go in and actually invoke it. So when we invoke it, the data itself, the process type is just going to be the review workflow. And that's the workflow that we saw earlier that's deployed. And again, any workflow, the process that you invoke is going to be effectively the same. The URL is going to be that, and we can actually take the variable that we pulled out from step 4. The most significant here is that it does need to be in an array. So the easiest way to handle that is just to put square brackets around it. So there's other ways that you can build an array and you can push items in there. But in our purpose, because we're typically going to be dealing with just the one, again, if we had done this in batch, if you had allowed the for each, the process in batch, then you could have pushed all the arrays in there at once by using what's called a data pill, and you could have just pushed all of them in there at once. And this is where the URL could be a drive, and I'm going to see if I can find a file that is, and actually I think this one will be good. Actually use it. So there's my presentation for today. The headers are all good. So if I save that. And the importance is it's going to return the process ID. And just because we're running short on time, I want to save that process ID. So I'm going to take an action, Reltio. I'm going to call the create record. But I really want to just do an update on the material. And because it's an update, the first thing you want to do is make sure you set partial override. And I want to include, of course, the crosswalks so that I get the right record. And that process ID. So the crosswalk is going to be Reltio. The value is going to be the URI from step 4. But in this case, the URI has the word entities in front of it. So again, just in the interest of time, SBLIT. I'm just going to do a split on it, and I'm going to take the entity ID that comes afterwards. And the significance there is, as you see, it passes in the entities / and the entity ID. Well, the entity crosswalk in Reltio, when you go to the crosswalk lineage page, you'll see that the Reltio entity ID is just the trailing enter. It does not have the entities on it. So it is necessary for you to split off the word entities in the front. And then I want that process ID that's getting returned from the workflow. And we want to put that in there. And what that's also going to do is, because we've now put the process ID in there, the next time this process runs, because at the beginning we're looking for ones where the process ID is missing, it should only run the one time. It should only start the workflow once. It's not registered. Missing header someplace.
And as you're kind of looking at that, Dan, and it's funny, an hour's already gone by.
Yeah.
But so there's only one last question, and then I posted that, Vinath, on your behalf on the community. So I'll have Dan try to answer that question in the next day or so. So hopefully that will help. By the way, thank you everyone for getting on such a last minute Ask Me Anything. I mean, there's been questions about Reltio Integration Hub and workflows, and there's requests to do some of these things. So, again, this will be recorded and posted directly to the community. So, you will have access to that in the next day or so as well. Figured out, Dan?
Not quite yet. Hey. All right, so there's our URI 5P. There's the workflow that got started, and we updated the object and put the workflow process ID back into the object. So if we come back and look at it, you can see the workflow is already there, but just to refresh the object, it's interesting. The so I went down to the bottom and I made a big deal about saying you need to make sure you set partial override. And I forgot to set partial override. So most importantly, what you'll see is now in our history, we have the original record that had all the data with the process before the process ID got assigned, and then the process ID got assigned. So I'm just going to close out this, delete this guy.
Start over, huh?
Material, and I know we're over, but test final, test, review, yes. And we now have the process ID on board and the workflow has started. And again, there's the document that I mentioned can be associated just as a comment is really the only way to link that in. If it's a comment, if it's a link in a comment, it's not a hot link. If you write it into a URL type in the file, it will be linkable. You can click on it. But the second half of this scenario is that you can have a second RIH process that periodically checks the process ID and checks to see if this workflow is still active. Because if I come in here on this workflow, once it gets closed out, then I mark it as reviewed, this workflow is done, but this life cycle is still pending. Well, the process is no longer going to do anything because that process ID is still on there. So you'll see there's no work to be done. So what I need to have is a second process that looks for records that have a process ID and then invoke the API to say, what is the status of that process ID? And I was working on that here. Well, my tokens are invalid, but we can do a follow-up session, or if anybody wants to continue on this, we can either have a part B, or I can just respond in the community about how to follow up and have a second process that checks on the status of these, in that when the first workflow is completed, you can have a second Reltio Integration Hub process that either sets the process ID to -1 and promotes the status from pending to active. And again, those types of things you can do in the workflow itself, but by doing them in the workflow, it does require you to write Java code and deploy it through the Reltio DevOps process, which it gives you a much greater control over the level of interaction that you do, but it does definitely require a more intricate development process.
Well, Dan, this has been great, and we did go a little bit over, and people are still on a little bit. They did fall off some, but I like the idea of an Ask Me Anything Part 2, where you kind of continue this on so that others can ask questions again. Maybe we'll look at the next couple of weeks to get that going, if you're okay with that, Dan.
Yeah, no, I definitely think let's give everybody a week to kind of review this and respond to some questions in the community, and then have a follow-up. I'm happy to do so.
Love it. Thanks everybody for coming. And again, this is recorded and will be posted hopefully by tomorrow or so, sometime this week for sure.